It's a pleasure to be here this morning and a pleasure to follow Professor Lee. The pleasure is made ambiguous by the gravity of his remarks. To speak of pleasure in the fact that we have something intellectually to contribute to one of the most enormous practical problems in the world is perhaps an odd way to approach it. So I won't stress the pleasure entirely, but I want to speak about possible futures. Every crisis opens possible futures, it's said, and we face concatenating crises today. Not just the financial crisis, on which the world is focused since 2008, not just the environmental crisis that Professor Lee has described, but a whole series of various kinds of crises. Refugees and forced migration, infectious disease, war. Each of these raises issues of governance, and we might be said to face a basic crisis there. I'm not very interested in the word. In many ways, crisis is a misleading and problematic word. It implies that a point has been reached where a resolution will become clearer one way or the other, and unfortunately, we have an enormous ability to keep making things worse. It's not clear when the point of crisis is. But I do want to suggest that the issue is important. And here, the issue of diagnosing the present situation, but also placing it in comparative and historical context and trying to understand the possible futures that are opened. I don't mean futurology in the sense of a simple scenario or projection. I mean trying to understand the factors that are embedded in our present circumstances and shape the possibilities before us. We face the challenge of understanding the current situation and anticipating possible futures in mixed circumstances intellectually. Part of what I would like to urge is the importance of renewing and strengthening comparative and historical political economy. In much of social science in recent years, there has been a trend to seek micro-foundations in order to pursue more secure explanatory generalizations. This has produced considerable gains. But I want to suggest that we fail to attend to the very large-scale historical and global patterns at our peril. We develop short historical memories at our peril. It's important to recognize the ways in which current circumstances are connected to previous global eras and to the long history of the modern world system. In many ways, part of what was lost with the decline of the earlier phases of Marxist theory was not just a particular theory, but a conversation, a set of problems and issues that linked people. It's important now that we build interdisciplinary ties, not least to biology, but not only to biology in the current era. And it's important that we link what we might think of as model-based and field-based science. That is, the kind of science that is based on formal modeling in order to grasp complex systems, and that which is based on an appreciation of specific contexts, largely through fieldwork. One of the things that makes it hard for us to deal with the current challenges is that these are almost completely disconnected parts of science, almost completely disconnected parts of sociology. Now, let me go back to the roots in the 1970s of the current crisis, understood in one of its forms as an economic and financial crisis. There had been a period of expanding global demand through the 1960s. A growing middle class in Europe and America sought to expand its consumption. This was part of the long-term, more or less linear demand expansion of the modern era, but a particular post-war boom. It was a boom in the rich countries of the world, les Trente Glorieuses in France, the post-war boom for Britain and America, but it was also an era of growth when newly independent countries in the post-colonial world sought growth and sought a greater say over their destinies. It was an era when a peace movement challenged a neo-imperialist war and dovetailed with a more general set of countercultural and political movements that challenged the institutional arrangements that had reconciled capitalism, democracy, and the Cold War in wealthy Western countries. These issues shaped both discontent and idealism on university campuses and put the university at the center of social upheaval. This was followed by a 1973-75 recession that is remembered largely for being triggered by OPEC production controls, petroleum production controls, and spiking oil prices that dramatized this. But the crisis was a good deal broader. And let me just note a few of its elements that have continuing impact today. A more substantial account would have to include attention to turmoil in exchange rates after the U.S. pulled out of the Bretton Woods Accord in 1971. This, among other things, caused the dollar to depreciate and revenues of oil suppliers to decline. If you're looking for echoes, they're present. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 was an inflection point in the ongoing entanglement of energy prices in politics, particularly but not only in the Middle East, and one that has continuing impacts, obviously, into the present day. Still broader factors in the background included the crises of authority and of welfare compromises represented by the range of social movements that came to the fore in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the crises of third world governments that, for example, first brought socialists to power and then led to military dictatorship in Chile and played out in different ways in different national contexts. The combination of demands for growth in less developed countries, consumption in rich countries, and a more or less egalitarian social transformation was hard to reconcile. To a large extent, the leaders of the capitalist world refused to face the crisis because it involved a widespread challenge to their authority and demands from many quarters for greater shares of wealth. They took instead to financing continued growth with credit, driving up budget deficits and sovereign debt, and creating sovereign wealth in a variety of new hands, and extracting profits through financial instruments and speculation rather than material production. The crisis of 2008 was in some ways a consequence of the unresolved crisis of the 1970s, which, in fact, was called the Great Recession in the 1970s until replaced by the still greater recession that we are living with today. And when I say it's in some ways a consequence, I don't just mean that there is a pattern of cycles. I mean that specific responses to the crisis included, for example, the creation of a variety of new kind of financial instruments outside the regulatory apparatuses of the world's states. Our current circumstances are, of course, shaped also by intervening events. Those symbolized by the year 1989 are important, though that year is a focal point in a longer process, not simply the moment of a transition. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which followed it just by a few years, the westward reorientation of most of Eastern Europe, the outward and more or less capitalist reorientation of China, the intensification of globalization that followed in the 1990s with accelerated trade as well as financialization, flows of people, IT and communications revolutions. And through all of this, a pattern of bubbles and crises. 1997 and the currency crisis in Southeast Asia could look local. 2002 could look like just a technology bubble, and then 2008, it was a pattern. And in all of this, add that there were war and security challenges, including those that were shaped by the tactic of spectacular violence. We have, in an ironic sort of way, almost domesticated this by thinking of it as terrorism, because the very language of terrorism tells us that this is something unto itself. It's a thing. It's out there. We can deal with it. We can even, in the words of unfortunate words of a U.S. president, have a war on terror. But the tactic of spectacular violence is part of a much more complex set of challenges in the contemporary world not so easily domesticated. And the response of creating war in Iraq and Afghanistan has only thrown into relief a variety of interconnections and difficulties, and perhaps above all, the decline of the United States and reorganization of global power. The world's one military superpower, the United States, is in a weaker economic and political situation than it has been since World War II. The decline is fed by economic phenomena that are not readily classifiable as either domestic or international. For example, the consumer boom, at least for elites, that was fueled by selling debt to China, the run-up to the 2008 crisis. Now, in this context, we can expect the world to face the complexities of not having an equally powerful hegemonic power. As the U.S. declines as a hegemonic power, it might go very gracefully. It might become a multilateral player, or it might go belligerently in a series of conflicts, as indeed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan suggest. I'm not offering a prediction of exactly the pattern. What I'm suggesting is that possible futures are opened precisely by the destabilization of a set of institutional arrangements which include, at their apex, the hegemonic power of the United States. Hegemony won't disappear overnight, but it is declining. There are a variety of major powers in the world, not only the US, but China, India, Europe. In the case of Europe, we have to ask the question these days of how well Europe will fare, and as Europe now has a foreign policy structure, will Europe in fact remain cohesive enough in political and economic terms to wield a foreign policy? European countries individually have been wrenched by their declining individual importance, and so there is a question mark about whether we speak of a single power. Russia is clearly still a major power in the world, though it's a question how much it will play a regional or a global strategy. We need to add to the list Iran, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey. Will they be major powers? Will they be secondary powers? This isn't the issue I want to highlight. What I want to suggest is that we're moving to an era in which a variety of geopolitical stabilizations that have long characterized modernity are being called into question. It has been common to give an account of modernity that centers on a Western European story and the story of some countries of Western European migration, like the United States, through the period since the 17th century. This is the account Emanuel Wallerstein would christen the modern world system, but it's an account that sociologists have approached as a matter of culture, in rationalization theories, as a matter of functionalist differentiation, or in a variety of different theoretical formulations. Sociology itself grew up in this world, a world which since the 17th century was thought of largely as a world of nation states, and in which sociologists could equate society more or less with national society. This was never entirely accurate. If this were a political science convention, the year 1648 would stand out as a pivotal year, the year of the Peace of Westphalia, which, among other things, suggested the centrality of the nation-state model and the secularization of European politics. Now, in each of these, it's misleading, because throughout the modern era, the European states that pioneered being nation-states also forged global empires. There was no point in this post-1648 era when there were nation-states that were simply the primary, self-subsisting, exclusive units of geopolitics in the world. 1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War, which could easily have been called the First World War. It was a war fought throughout the colonial structures of the Americas, of Southeast Asia, of, indeed, Central Asia. It's a war, the parameters of which would look current to readers of today's newspapers. A war that focused, for example, on the question of Islam in the region of Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not just suggesting that history repeats itself. I'm suggesting that there are patterns that get obscured by our conceptual frameworks. And so if we accept the proposition that modernity is simply the rise of a set of cultural structures and political structures like the nation state through the last 4 centuries, and we don't pay attention to the limits of that view in that period, that is, for understanding our recent past, we won't do very well looking to the future. We are moving to an era when the different powers of the world are contending more openly with each other, not in a war, such as World War I or World War II, structured within this modern world system, but in new and significant ways. We don't know whether the several powers of the emerging world system will be organized in a multipolar or a multilateral way. That is, will they cooperate in new institutional regimes of shared governance, for example, in order to tackle the environmental problems that Professor Lee raised, or will they compete with each other in a variety of military and economic and other ways? We don't know how much of the needed governance institutions will be organized globally and how much regionally. And this is not just a matter of civilizational histories, though they're important, but also of geopolitics. So I would add to the story that we have issues not just of the story of civilizations which endure through various arrangements, but of geopolitical issues and fault lines which are recurrently troubling. We face an era in many ways which we might think of as one of re-regionalization, an era when regions in the world are becoming newly important, when interregional trade, for example, is becoming a significant issue. We could provincialize America and think of it as one part of this, and think of the North American region in this context. Europe, as I've suggested, faces a variety of challenges in its integration, with what sociologists have called system integration racing ahead, while social integration is confined to a very considerable degree to an elite, which has fed a renewal of nationalism in other parts, the expansion of the EU, immigration, economic disparities, and foreign policy disunity are all factors. The jury is out on how much Europe is something completely new and how much it is an extension of similar patterns to those which brought together the regions of France, for example, in building a nation state. But Europe is clearly a central region, and we clearly now think of it as a region, and we should remind ourselves how much of an change in vocabulary that is. But then we should look at Asia, at a region where there has been an enormous growth in external economic importance, so that Americans are constantly aware of how much debt has been sold to China, how many products are imported from China, but where we miss the point if we focus on that because of the centrality of internal trade. In almost every year of the last 20, foreign direct investment has been greater among Asian countries than between Asia and the rest of the world. The internal integration of Asia is making a bigger Asia, not East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, but Asia in a broad sense, a much more significant part of the world, and much more importantly organized internally. And indeed, even with new foreign policy linkages of various kinds to deal with the US. Russian assertions of regional hegemony are significant, and I'm going to sort of cut down on detail on the list and just sort of run out. The importance of the attempt to stabilize its near abroad is a basic issue for Russia, but Russia, though it has reeled for more than 20 years, is not to be counted out as a world power and is becoming increasingly significant in a variety of international relations. Latin America, where there have been new nationalisms, new populisms, but also a rethinking of regionalism is a significant pattern. But the old image of Latin America has to shift and take account of new realities as well, including dramatic globalization, but also including NAFTA and the partial shift of Mexico into a North American orbit. I'm not going to go through all of the old regions and sort of lay this out. What I want to sum up is the importance of paying attention to these regions, the importance of area studies, but also the limits of conventional approaches to regional knowledge. Not only have we tended to build comparative sociology overwhelmingly in the comparison of nation-state units, not with enough attention to these larger units, but we have let, as I suggested at the beginning, context-specific knowledge become too much separated from the pursuit of generalization, so that the development of the better explanatory models and the more detailed contextual knowledge are not informing each other enough. And here, what I want to suggest also is that we have to rethink what the areas are. In the US, an example would be the fact that there was no university-based center of Central Asian studies prior to the current decade. Right? Central Asia, long literally a sort of center of the world, has come back into the foreground with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and has become a recurrent source of crisis, fighting, and conflict. I've mentioned already the broad inter-Asian integration. But think also of trade routes as areas. The long civilizational nexes, for example, the routes that combine trade and the spread of religion as Islam spread through the world, and spread not least as Yemeni and other traders plied sea routes through Asia, the Hadrami traders, for example, all along coastal Asia. Migration routes, or think of environmental regions, the regions that face shared environmental threats, as indeed part of Central Asia does. Or think of the regions formed by oil pipelines, where there are challenges of regional integration. These are not civilizational regions. These are not regions formed simply by common cultural heritage, though there is heritage. They are regions made by history, and they are regions that are moving to the foreground. So we now face, in the era, a future of a pursuit of global economic power along these various lines, with new paths and new alliances, but with old geopolitical and regional structures coming to the fore. This appears in discussions of China and the world, China's relationship to Africa. I just spent much of the summer traveling in Africa, where one of the most distinctive things is the prominence of Chinese construction projects, Chinese workers, even Chinese land purchases on a large scale, and the question of migration. But there's also China in the rest of Asia, in Russia, in Latin America, and elsewhere. There is a reworking of what seemed to be the stable units. There are new structures that shape the pursuit of development as development comes back on the agenda. And an oddity of our recent period is the extent to which, since that recession of the 1970s, which I pointed out, the idea of economic development has been pushed to the back burner until it has recently returned. It is as though people thought that you might have humanitarian assistance or help for the poor, but not a project of massive transformation. In both political and economic terms, the idea of large-scale transformation in the world was more or less put on hold by most of the academic leaders of our discussion and most of the world's political leaders. It has returned in significant ways, with new questions about the role of the state, the role of global capital, the role of international partners, and perhaps above all, environmental sustainability. So I would add to Professor Lee's good account the point that we face the challenge of what he called the overdeveloped and the underdeveloped world working out a new way, precisely at a moment when there is a renewal of the aspiration for development. It doesn't come at a period when there has been a substantial pattern of continuous gradual development, but rather a dramatic renewal after 30 years of abeyance of the project of development, which will make it all the harder to work out some of this balance. In all of this, there's a continued restructuring of the relations between the national and the transnational. I've suggested repeatedly that we shouldn't assume that the nation-state was ever simply the automatic unit of world affairs, but we shouldn't assume that it is becoming a completely unimportant unit now. We shouldn't imagine that there is an easy sort of cosmopolitan structure of global governance which can be achieved, which would not itself depend on cooperation among nation-states and would not itself raise the basic challenges of internal politics within those nation states. In fact, what we've seen in recent years is an intensification of capitalism, an intensification of various sorts of global factors associated with that, migration, for example, but not only that, and a continued reliance on nation states to manage this, even while some of the tools by which nation states do their management have been undermined. The growth of international regulatory regimes and organizations is significant and dramatic, but, and I suspect Saskia Sassen will speak of some of this, huge change in the world that she's called the reassemblage of territory, authority, and rights. But I would add to the picture of this and emphasize the extent to which many of these are still creatures of nations and states, and also the extent to which these are undergoing profound change and have been challenged, not least by the failure of financial regulation in the context of the global crisis. And in this context, I would suggest there is a resurgence of nationalism. There's a resurgence of nationalism in some great powers, some, like Russia, hoping to return to a stage they feel is more rightly theirs, some, like China, taking a renewed role in the world after a period of partial marginalization from larger global affairs. In nationalism in Latin America, whatever its crises, a significant right-wing nationalism in Europe, and in some ways in the United States, the so-called Tea Party. We are actually looking at an era when nationalism is on the renewal, and some of the responses to environmental crises are nationalist responses with the threat of resource wars and the threat of attempts to go it alone. Just a couple more words on how many different things are intersecting. Sociology had its own roots in that European modernization story that I discussed, and among other things, it understood itself and it understood society in largely secular terms and adopted a secularization story of the expectation of a declining role of religion. This hasn't been borne out by history. It's not something that just stopped being borne out in the last 10 or 20 years with the dramatic renewal of both Christian and Islamic religion around the world. It's something that never was quite the world story. It was partially a European story, though a more recent European story, with secularization really being a post-World War II phenomena for the most part in Europe. The decline of religion, in any case, hasn't happened. And world religions are significant. Now, I mention this not just to suggest the importance of paying attention to religion, but the importance of not treating religions as somehow the local. Religions are among the most important forms of transnational global organization. They are growing dramatically, they are evangelizing, they involve internal patterns of migration and communication, they organize for action like humanitarian relief. So world religions are a significant factor with which sociology is only beginning to deal and which has to be fully integrated into the attempt to understand possible futures. Professor Lee mentioned cities. The majority of the population of the world lives in cities. Here, sociology has from its outset had an engagement in urbanization in cities. The importance of cities as economic drivers, the importance of urban social problems to a variety of different fields of sociology. But a respatialization is underway, and I won't try with Saskia on the program later to outline this more, save to suggest that it has sometimes been taken as evidence of the decline of the state, but it really would make more sense to see a range of new sorts of governance actors, new kinds of state actors associated with cities and metropolitan governance around the world. It's important to see that cities have changed their character as they've grown, that there is a poor fit of today's cities to the classic model of urban centers and public space, and our images of cities have not kept up with the transformation. And cities are sites of massive inequality, which is often not integrated effectively, but is a side-by-side juxtaposition. The issues of environment and resources, closely related to cities and the still significant rural world, since we still eat, have already been outlined by Professor Lee, which saves me from spending time on them, save only to repeat the message that I gave a moment ago, that state strategies for control and benefit are playing a basic role even though the environmental problems are global. Even though they cut straight across state boundaries, states are the mechanisms that have been brought. And with impending dearth, the coping mechanisms of state and the potentials of conflict are great. And let me close with a comment on the challenge of thinking about all of this, the challenge that we face because we confront this in an era when not just our discipline, but the whole university structure within which sociology has grown is under challenge and ongoing transformation. I could go back and use the word crisis I began with, for many universities are in crisis. The University of California, for example, very notably in my country. I want to suggest here, too, that crisis brings possible futures. Sociologists have often spent a lot of time defending boundaries of the discipline against psychology, against economics, or against other fields. But I think this is a moment when that is a terrible strategy, when we really need to take up, as I suggested at the outset, international political economy, when we really need to take up a relationship with biology and atmospheric sciences in order to understand the environment. But we need to take on these new interdisciplinary relationships precisely at a moment when the university itself is in massive upheaval, when there are huge pressures on social sciences for rankings, for funding, for jobs, and this is a hard time to call for an intellectual renewal. But we have very little choice. Precisely in this context, when we face a crisis in our very own employment relationship, we need to take on the challenge of better understanding global crises. Thank you.